Talk about problems that occur on sports fields. Turf will go brown for many reasons, and it's very difficult sometimes to understand why it's gone brown, what's caused it, and how to control it. So we'll talk about some of the ways that can be used to diagnose turf problems. There are two different classifications of problems on sports fields. The first is termed biotic, and that means that it's caused by some kind of pathogen or vector, something living. So it could be a weed problem, an insect pest problem, or a disease problem. The second group is called abiotic problems, and those are physiological problems or stresses and something that's maybe caused by the human influence or human error. The first thing then we'll look at then as far as a biotic problem would be weeds. Weeds are quite common on sports fields because we put a lot of traffic and wear on sports fields. We do a lot to them. We have aggressive games on them. We play sports on fields at times of the year during inclement weather when the grasses get worn away, etc. And there are certain weeds that do really well in those types of conditions. They can grow in hard soils, they can grow in shade. Some weeds are very adapted to growing in very specific soil physical and chemical properties that grasses don't like. So weeds on sports fields can be quite difficult to control if there's reoccurring issues on that field, for example, excessive amounts of games that are played. Where do weeds come from? They come from a variety of sources. They can come with birds, they can be carried on the wind, they can come from bits of plants that are brought in by stems, roots, etc. We have what we call a seed bank in the soil already that's there. So for example, crabgrass is a weed that has a seed bank in the soil. It just needs a trigger like light or warmth for that grass to germinate. What's wrong with weeds? Why don't we want weeds on a sports field? Some of them are green, and we can, like clover. Clover is a common weed. It's green and it doesn't retract too much from the playing conditions. So what's wrong with it? Why don't we want weeds on fields? Well, first of all, they're going to compete with the turf grasses for sunlight, moisture and nutrients. So the more weeds on the field, the less healthy the turf grass. They can adversely affect playability of the field and safety of the athlete. They can be tripping hazards. They can form these clumps where a child or an athlete may be running and then fall over. So they can become a playability issue. They can detract from the uniformity of a surface, and they can actually increase the maintenance of that surface. They need taken care of differently than the turf grasses. Some of them actually go dormant or die when they get stressed. So the picture on the left there is a specific grass called rough bluegrass, and it doesn't like heat, so it goes dormant and looks brown and looks as bad as this in the picture right in the middle of August, just before the high school football season starts. So some of them can cause problems because they go dormant or die either in heat or in frost. Weeds are problem indicators though, so if there's a weed infestation on a field, it's there for a reason. So rather than looking at this situation and saying, okay, we have this weed that runs right down the middle of this football field, let's go out and buy a chemical that we can spray that would kill this weed. This weed is there for a reason. This particular weed is called knotweed, and it is an indicator of hard, compacted soils. So the most sustainable approach to this control of this weed would be to remedy the soil, remediate the soil, make it a better growing environment for the turf. That is going to prevent this weed from coming in the future and make the grass more healthy. Rather than just addressing the problem of the weed, it's better to address the issue as to why that weed is there in the first place. There are two types of weeds, and the weed killers that we use to kill them can differentiate between them. So there's broadleaf weeds, as you can see they have a broadleaf, and then there's grassy weeds which have the singular parallel veined grass-like weed here on the right hand side. So the herbicides or the weed killers that we use can differentiate between these two. So there are chemicals that can be used that would kill broadleaf weeds but not kill the grass, and there are chemicals that kill grasses but do not kill broadleaf weeds. So the chemicals will differentiate between the two different types of plants. As far as diseases, this is another problem on sports fields, particularly in wet, humid times of the year. This is called the disease triangle. This is the standard triangle that determines if you will get a disease problem. These three things have to be present for the disease to occur. It has to be the right environment, which typically is humid, wet and warm would be an ideal environment for a disease to occur. The host has to be right, so in other words, the grass type in this particular instance has to be susceptible to that particular disease. And then the pathogen has to be there. The majority of our diseases on turf grasses are caused by fungal pathogens, fungi, and they have to be there either in the soil or in the water or in the air for the disease to occur. So when these three things come together, environment, host and pathogen, that creates the perfect storm for a particular disease to happen on turf. Looking at the grey leaf spot as an example of a disease on turf, there are signs of the disease where we can actually physically see the fungal growth itself, the hypha or the mycelium. We can physically see the fungal growth, and then there are symptoms that we can see. And in this particular instance, the grass goes brown, starts to collapse in on itself, and then the most effective way of identifying a disease is by its spores. These are the way that the disease is spread, almost like the seeds of the disease. We call them spores, and the spores for each disease are different in shape, and we can take a portion of a diseased leaf sample and put it under a microscope and take a look at these spores, and that will help to clearly identify what the particular turfgrass disease is. So a turfgrass manager, what he or she does is to look for signs, look for symptoms, and possibly even send a sample away to a lab to get those spores identified, to clearly identify the type of disease that's occurring. So this would be a signs of the disease. The disease shows itself first thing in the morning. So field managers typically will walk across the turf very first thing in the morning when the dew is still on the leaf and there's still moisture present. We'll see this mycelium. Mycelium is this cotton candy, white woolly material or fungi material that you can see here. Will be present first thing in the morning. When the dew is burnt off the grass, the sun comes out and burns that moisture off, that mycelium goes away. So turfgrass identification is best done first thing in the morning. Again, you can see the mycelium here and the hyphae here of the fungal disease. And again, this particular disease is dollar spot, and first thing in the morning this mycelium is present. There are other types and signs of fungal disease. The top left there is a disease called red thread. The red threads that can be seen are actually the hypha of the fungus, and then these are the pustules, bottom right, of a disease called rust, which is very commonly seen on sports fields in the spring and the fall. This is dollar spot, one of the signs and symptoms of dollar spot. Obviously the mycelium is present and the hypha is present first thing in the morning, and then the grass has this hourglass appearance to it, where the leaf shrinks in the middle and creates this hourglass shape which has these brown bands at either end. And this is what dollar spot looks like further back. So the mycelium is seen in the morning, and then this banding across the leaf is seen. They call it dollar spot disease because it's the spots are initially about the same size as a silver dollar, and then they get larger and they mottle together and they create these quite large patches of diseased and dying turf, as you can see on the left. A lot of the diseases will grow in circles. They'll grow in a circular fashion, so sometimes it's easy to say, even if you don't know what type of disease it is, it would perhaps be quite easy to look at this particular picture and say, okay, just by the circular nature of the pattern and the fact that there's dead turf dying in these circles and these patches, it probably is a turfgrass disease. And again, if you look at this is a green circle, a dark green circle with mushrooms in it. This is a disease called fairy ring, and this is very common on park and rec and general turfgrass areas. What's happening here is that there's some kind of wood or organic material in the soil, and the fungus is decaying that organic material, and as it decays the organic material, it's releasing nitrogen, which makes the grass grow very dark green in that circle. Most of the fairy rings don't cause death to the turf. There's one type that does. Most of them will just be kind of unsightly, and they'll actually just keep growing and growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger until you can't see them anymore. Some diseases are really hard to identify. Something like this could easily be a fuel or a gasoline spill, just excessive wear, excessive wetness. Sometimes it's difficult to tell, which is why the combination of the signs, the symptoms and the spores are sometimes needed to get a clear picture. Insect pests is the third biotic factor that we'll talk about. There are several insect pests on cool and warm season grasses that can cause problems. The biggest problem that we have with these types of pests is that they will chomp away through the roots. So things like white grubs, they're actually eating the organic material at the top of the turf grass, but in doing so they also eat and chomp through the turf grass roots. So a lot of these insects will either eat the turf grass blades or tissue, or they will eat the roots, and that's how they cause these problems. White grubs are caused by many different types of beetles. Beetle larvae are probably the most common insect pests on turf, and then there's other beetles and caterpillars and weevils and mole crickets and things like that that can cause problems. This is another one that can cause problems, and there's certain diagnostic things that we can do. Turfgrass entomologists on the web will have different instructional videos on how to diagnose specific insect problems, what to look for, because some of them will look different in the larval stage than they do as an adult, and then there are certain clues that you can look for in the turf to determine what type of insect has caused the damage. Moving on from biotic stresses, we'll talk a little bit about abiotic stresses, which are the physiological stresses. This particular one is heat stress. This is drought stress. Turf grasses that have drought stress will show a few things. First of all, they will show footprinting. When the grasses lose water from their plant cells during heat and drought, they will footprint. When you stand on the grass, it does not spring back up, it loses its turgidity, so you will actually see footprinting. Then the grass goes a dark colour, a very dark colour, before it goes brown and then eventually dies. This is what a close-up looks like of drought stress turf, where the water is being depleted from the plant cells and the leaves are shrinking and dying. This particular disorder is caused by frost. Pockets of frost will occur on the turf and will cause this frost damage. Soil compaction is one of the most common physiological problems on sports fields. Because sports fields are used a lot and the soils get very hard, soil compaction is probably the #1 problem on sports fields where turf grasses cannot grow in hard soils. Algae form, weeds start to come in. So this is a classic hard soil. If you look at this picture, the grass looks unhealthy. It's not very dark green. It's started to lose density. It's become very thin. The soil probe can't be placed in the soil more than about an inch because the soil's too hard. The black crust on the surface is algae, which grows in hard, compacted, wet soils. And then that particular weed that you see there, bottom left, is clover, which can grow in hard, compacted soils, and so will start to take over the field. This is a common occurrence in the spring when the grasses get saturated. We get a lot of rain and the soils become saturated. If there's no oxygen in the root zone, in the soil, the turf can't take nutrients up, so it starts to look chlorotic, yellow, brown, and very unhealthy because it can't take nitrogen up. This is not a not a problem as such, as it's a different type of grass. Warm season grasses that are grown in the northern states or in northern countries, as soon as the first frost hits, they'll go dormant. So sometimes when you see brown grass, it isn't that it's dead, it's that it's gone dormant. In addition to the physiological problems that can happen on turf, the human impact can have a huge influence on the health of a sports field. This is a particular scenario where this field was shared by the soccer team and the football team, and the soccer coach had the crown or the elevated area of the field removed because he wanted a flat field for soccer. When he took the crown off, that meant that the field didn't drain, the water couldn't shed off the surface of the field, and it just turned into a big muddy mess. So sometimes some of the decisions that are made in relation to a sports field can cause problems. Inadequate water or irrigation can obviously cause problems. Turf grasses, especially during the summer months, need water to survive. In the fall and the spring, the opposite is true. We can have too much water and these fields can't drain. So ideally a field should be able to take 1 inch of rain in an hour and not have standing water, but many fields don't. Many fields have very low water infiltration rates, and just after 10 or 15 minutes of rain, that water will start to form on the surface, so drainage rates can be quite poor on these fields. Poor mowing is something that's frequently seen, which is nobody's fault really. In the spring and the fall, when the grass is growing excessively, many parks and rec and school grounds crews just do not have the manpower or the time to keep on top of mowing, so they'll just mow when they can, as fast as they can and as low as they can, just to try and get the grass cut. This is what dull mower blades look like. If mower blades aren't kept sharp, they will look like this. Heavy use is another. Many fields are used by multiple sports, and in this particular example the football field was actually also used as the baseball outfield and as well as a summer band camp. And when you have excessive use like that, the field doesn't have time to recover. Again, it's something that it's not so much human error as much as human influence, where these fields need to be scheduled to give them at least some rest time. And so signage is a good way of doing that, to try and keep people off and try and communicate to the public or to the athletes or the coaches or the booster clubs that these fields are living, and they need time to recover between playing seasons. Misapplication is something that again is a human influence. Both of these slides are applications of fertilizer, nitrogen, that were not put out correctly, so you can see the striping where one strip of grass got nitrogen and then the next strip of grass didn't. In this particular instance, chemicals were used to kill weeds or kill diseases, and then the operator either walked through the chemical and then tracked it across the grass. As you can see the top two pictures, you can clearly see the footprints, or the applicator or the sprayer was left on. So on the bottom left, this particular instance, somebody at the school was spraying a weed killer around the posts to try and kill the grass, so they didn't need to strim around the posts, but they kept the applicator on and were walking across the field and killed the grass between each post. And then the bottom right, the wrong type of chemical was put in the sprayer and sprayed on a field. So as we said before earlier, that diseases typically grow in circles. Diseases do not grow in footprints or straight lines or wiggly lines. If you see symptoms like this, it is typically human error. How do we go about preventing and controlling some of these problems? The number one thing is to know your enemy. So our turfgrass students will go through their degrees and they'll learn all about these problems, and they'll learn great diagnostic tools and prediction tools. Diagnostic tools include things like hand lenses, cameras, notebooks, posters, online resources, keeping good records. Posters can be put up around the facility so that you can start to identify different weeds. Dr. Shetler here on the left, he He can put insect traps out, and he does flushing techniques and all different kinds of ways to get a good handle on what type of insects are occurring locally. We use something called phenology, growing degree days. Basically what that means is when certain plants are flowering, we know that certain insect pests or diseases or weeds are happening at the same time. A good example of that is this particular shrub is called forsythia. When the forsythia blooms in the spring, we know that at the same time a weed called crabgrass is emerging. So we have identification, we have scouting for problems, and we have the phenology data that's out there. Two useful tools are local weather stations, and then there are also now a few online prediction models. This particular one on the right is by a company called Syngenta, Greencast. You type in your zip code and it will tell you what pests, diseases and weeds are happening at the moment on turf in your particular area. One of the things that's important is to set thresholds. So for example, how many grubs per square feet is acceptable on a park and rec soccer field compared to perhaps a Major League Soccer professional field. So setting thresholds is something that the field manager does in conjunction with the field users, and it may be that the field users say, we don't want any chemicals using on our fields, we want it all to be organic, we don't care if the field is covered in clover, we don't care if there's the odd insect, pest or disease, we don't want any chemicals. It may be that the field users, the coaches, the public say, no, we don't want any diseases, pests or weeds on these fields. We want to use whatever products or whatever is at your disposal to make sure that that doesn't happen. So setting thresholds is an important piece of problem prevention and control. It's also good to be able to predict emergence with local weather stations, with local prediction models. This is done by knowing soil temperatures, growing degree days, phenology. These are all ways that a field manager can predict what's going to happen that year and when these weeds are going to emerge, when these diseases are going to happen. And that's done because each of these weeds has a life cycle, and each of the insect pests have a life cycle, and each of the diseases have a life cycle. So it's important for the field managers to know the life cycles of these particular biotic problems so that they can plan to prevent them and to control them if they happen. This is something that I put together many years ago. It's a diagnostic tool for Ohio. These are all the problems that occur on turf in Ohio. So the green boxes represent weeds, the yellow boxes represent insect problems, the pink boxes represent disease problems, and then the blue and the yellow are physiological problems like saturated soils or drought. So you can see that turf grasses in Ohio are susceptible to a lot of problems during the season. Now if you went across to Scotland, you might typically only see 2 diseases, for example. Ohio, because we have a lot of warm, humid weather, are susceptible to a lot of diseases. Places like Scotland, where it's windy and the humidity isn't as high and the temperatures aren't as high, they may only have 1 or 2 diseases to deal with. States like Colorado, field managers in Colorado will only have maybe 1 disease to deal with in a year. So depending on where you are, it's important to put together this type of diagnostic map so that you are completely aware of what could occur and what time of year those problems occur so that you can prevent them. There's 4 different methods of control. There's cultural control, chemical control, biological control, and genetic host resistance. And this is really to do with sustainability. Sustainability is obviously the hot word right now, the hot topic in all areas of our living, of our environment. From a turf standpoint, again, sustainability means that whatever we do is economically viable. In other words, that we can afford to do it and it's economically a good decision. That it's socially acceptable. The field users are happy with the way that the field is managed, and that it's environmentally friendly. Best management practices then our cultural management practices that we do, we have to have a good understanding of irrigation, fertilizer applications, mowing, aerification or spiking, deep tining, scarification, vertical mowing, any kind of surface organic management, and top dressing. These are the standard practices that take place on an athletic field, and it's important that the athletic field manager understand when these get done, how often they get done, why they get done, because each of these will significantly impact the health of the turf, and if the turf is healthy, it's more able to compete with weeds, pests and diseases. Water, as we said earlier, is one of the key issues. If a field is overwatered, it creates huge problems. If it's underwatered, it creates huge problems. So understanding water management is key. And hand in hand with baseball fields, of course, the use of plastic covers and tarps can have a huge influence on disease incidence and turf health. Mowing again is a key. If the mowing height is too low, the grass is stressed. If it's too high, it doesn't dry out quickly enough and causes other problems. So each one of these cultural practices has very specific criteria how they're carried out in relation to turf health. Again, we talked about using blowers and other additional tools to help in adverse weather conditions. Plant genetic resistance is really important. There are many different cultivars or varieties of turf grasses. Some of them are more susceptible to diseases, insects than others. So it's important for the field manager to have a clear understanding of which particular grasses are best in which particular situation and in which particular geographic location. Pesticides are available. The term pesticides refers to all chemical products, and then under that umbrella there are three that we use in turf. Herbicides are used to control weeds, fungicides are used to control diseases, insecticides are used to control pests. Each of these chemicals has a mode of action. Some of them are selective and will control one organism and not another. Some of them are non-selective. So for example, there's a weed killer that will kill all plants, and then there's also a weed killer that will just kill broadleaf weeds and not kill the turf. There are contact and systemic, so there are chemicals that will kill just what it touches, and then there are chemicals that are taken in by the plant and will kill the whole plant, including the root system. There's preventative and curative management chemical programs where it's better to prevent the disease from happening in the first place rather than wait until you see it and then try and control it, because by the time you see it the grass is dead. And then there's in weed killers there's pre-emergent and post-emergent methods of action as well, where the pre-emergent means that the chemical forms a barrier on the soil surface that stops the weed from germinating. Post-emergence means that the herbicide kills the weed once the weed is mature and is seen. So there's all these different modes of actions, and it's extremely important to follow the label on the chemical to make sure that they're applied at the right time, right place, right rate. In many situations the field manager will have a professional applicator come in and make the applications, or the field manager will have been through a training program and be able to apply their own chemicals. There's all different types of resources out there. This is a particular one that comes from Ohio State. One of the problems with using chemicals is that the pest, disease or weed can become resistant to that chemical, so it's important to rotate different chemical families, especially for problems like diseases. It's important to rotate chemicals to make sure that that pest does not become resistant. There are natural organic control products out there. This is corn gluten meal, which is a fertilizer and natural herbicide. There are biological controls out there. Most common, of course, in horticulture is the ladybug that feeds on aphids. In turf grasses, the biologicals are really the most common ones would be the parasitic nematodes that are used to control grubs. The biological control really isn't a big part of turf grass management yet. So in summary, as far as turfgrass problems, it's really important to be able to predict when a problem is going to happen and to make the right diagnosis. Record keeping is key. Sound cultural practices are the first thing that must be taken care of, because if a turfgrass is healthy, it has less problems with pest diseases and weeds. Next, always important to choose turf grasses and grow turf grasses that are resistant to the local pest diseases and weeds. And then if the pest disease or weed still occurs, obviously the best control method should be chosen, and that must be based on a sustainable approach. So what's economically viable, what's acceptable to the field users, and what's the most environmentally sound method. And that ends this podcast on sports turf problems.